Hello, this is the Debka Files. I'm Gabrielle Weiniger with the exclusive news, insight and political analysis from the Middle East and around the world. Coming up on the programme this week. Russia guarantees Israel and Jordan peace and protection on its borders with Syria, in pledges revealed here on the Debka Files for the first time. A Debka Files exclusive, we reveal the assassination attempt on Hamas's security chief in the Gaza Strip last week was an inside job. Plus, a royal dream or a sci-fi reality. The Saudi crown prince reveals his plan for a new desert megacity that contains more robots than humans. Now to our top story, rare insights into Russia's strategy on Iran and Syria. Russia has promised Israel and Jordan that war will not break out wherever Moscow has military presence in Syria. This according to Debka's military and intelligence sources that we can now reveal for the first time. This took place during the Russian defense minister's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli army officials on October 16th. General Sergei Shoigu did say minor local infractions may occur, such as the Syrian missile attack on Israeli jets that happened on the day of his arrival, but that he can guarantee the Jewish state that it has protection from any offensive led by Iran and would not allow Israel's borders to heat up. No word on protection from Hezbollah on the border with Lebanon. Russia did deny reports that Iran was to set up an air and sea base inside Syria. The Russian defense minister also promised not to let the Turkish army invade Syria in the face of threats by Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan to conquer its northern regions, including the embattled province of Idlib. This turning true as Ankara has so far refrained from initiating a major operation there and limiting itself to posting 8 watchtowers just inside its northern border. Here's Erdogan with another line on Idlib this week.
İdlib'deki operasyon büyük ölçüde hamdolsun neticelendi. Şu anda Afrin konumuz var önümüzde. Bunların hepsi bizim için birer tehdittir. Ve biz ülkemiz için tehdit oluşturacak her alanda kararlıyız. Bunu herkesin bilmesini istiyoruz. Buralardan taviz veremeyiz. İşte daha önce de söyledik, bir gece ansızın gelebiliriz, bir gece ansızın vurabiliriz.
Now, as for Syria's political future, the Kremlin outlining a de-escalation plan between rival military forces through the creation of separation zones. That's part of a cooling down of the armed conflict ahead of the transition process. Moscow set to ask President Bashar al-Assad to sit down with the Syrian opposition and accept a power-sharing agreement. This as a 7th round of Syrian peace talks kicks off in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana. Now, to break this all down, let's turn to this week's guest, Dr. Nir Boms of the Tel Aviv University. Dr. Boms, great to have you back on the show.
Good to be here.
Let's begin with Moscow's strategy on Syria. The Kremlin seems to be predicting an end to this over 6-year-long civil war. Does Russia have a free hand in moulding the shape of things to come?
Well, Russia had been playing a very smart card. They entered the war in a very significant way rather late, to remind you, right after the JCPOA, the Iran agreement. This is where they have really asserted their military presence and really have done what was needed in order to bring the shape of events back into Assad's hands. They've been playing an important role ever since, but it's important to note that they have been there before. So what they have done is really extended their role and really positioned themselves and maneuvered themselves on the background of an American very kind of a hesitant policy, the background of the other players getting tired to really be the wheeler and dealer of all of this. And that plays a role in the international arena where Russia had blocked over 13 times resolutions against Syria, and that certainly plays a role on the ground, because really Russia is the country that now leads the Astana process. The Americans are really just observers. The UN is there to observe, but Russia is really calling the shots, and they also were able to bring Turkey on the one hand and Iran as the guarantors for this de-escalation plan that they've had. They have written a constitution, and they actually have people on the ground there, military police, in order to deal with affairs on the ground as Syria is getting slowly into a different chapter in its future.
So if they're calling the shots, they've guaranteed Israel and Jordan's safety on its borders. Is this enough to placate the Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, the answer is mixed here. If Israel needs to choose between Russia and Iran, then it's a sort of an obvious choice. But what the Russians are saying is that we will help put a certain distance to Iranian activity from the border, and they may be able to do that. But the problem is that on the ground you actually have additional activity. You have militias. This activity is becoming local. And then the issue is who is actually getting away. So if it's Syrian Hezbollah, if some of the forces that are being built as local militias and local proxy groups, well, then, they're not really a part of the agreement. So Israel still certainly have some work there, and I don't think that Israel will sign on to whatever the Russian agenda is. Israel has a different agenda, particularly in the south.
And Dr. Bombs, seventh round of peace talks in Astana does begin this week. They're talks backed by Russia, Iran and Turkey. What's the focus? What's on the agenda here?
It seems that this round has been focused on two main things. First of all, another phase in the de-escalation plan, and then some particular issues about prisoners exchange, swap of individuals, and some of the arrangements involving the groups that are coming there. Remember that the groups that are on the table are not all the groups. They are connected to the proxy players that had called for this meeting. And this is almost an admission that really this is the process now. It's not in Geneva, it's in Astana, it's not in America, and it's not the UN, it's the Russian process. And that means that Assad has the backing, and really what we're negotiating now is how to de-escalate. We still have some calls that Assad cannot stay and Assad must go, but overall, these calls are weaker. It comes from people who are not even a part of the table. It comes from some of the groups funded by the Gulf countries that are not there partially because Iran is there. And really, it joins the sort of the trend of the last few months, in where Assad's hand, again backed up by Russia and also in some ways by Iran, really has the upper hand.
Reports also indicating that Astana may call for a 6-month cessation of hostilities between government and rebel forces. Dr. Bomb, stay with us as we move along. Meanwhile, Russia's deputy foreign minister has visited the Kurdish town of Kashmili in northern Syria this week to meet with Kurdish officials. This according to Debka sources on the ground there. Mikhail Bogdanov met with Saleh Muslim Mohammed. He's the former co-chairman of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party and the driving power behind the de facto autonomy for the Kurdish-controlled region of Rojava. That's home to some 2.5 million Kurds in the north of the country there. Sources saying Moscow is looking to recruit the Kurdish alliance away from Washington after the US stayed silent over the Iraqi government takeover of Kurdish land in Iraq. Russia has offered the Syrian Kurds a guarantee to defend their cantons from the Syrian army, as well as from the Turkish army, who view the Syrian Kurds as allied with the Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, who's waging its own campaign for self-rule inside Turkey. In a fast-moving deal with Moscow, the Kurds have already given up a major gas field captured just days earlier from the Islamic State group in Deir ez-Zor. It's a surprise move that Debka analysts say is the result of these unprecedented direct talks between high-ranking Russian and Kurdish officials. Earlier, under a secret deal we reported on last week between the US and Russia, the Syrian Kurds were given the largest Syrian oil field of Al Omar after it was taken from ISIS. That's considered a bigger prize than the gas field of Konoko. Meantime, a new diplomatic dispute is deepening the Kurdish divide with the US. Syrian Kurds angry at Washington for belittling jailed PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. Kurdish officials airing their reactions in statements and videos that are being widely shared now on social media. The US offered a rather stuttering no comment on that issue. Here's that.
These are the posters, right, of what I would say.
The posters, they released the video basically in response to your comments.
Okay, I'm not aware of this video that was released, and a lot of comments and things that come in from either leaders or groups around the world. I'm not going to comment on in particular. But hold on.
Let's cross back to this week's guest, Dr. Nir Bombs. Will we see Syria's Kurds turn to Russia, especially given that ISIS is on their way out of Raqqa? And there may be rising concerns that Washington will no longer need their alliance.
Well, the Kurds feel betrayed by Washington, and that's the first piece of this puzzle. And the second piece of this puzzle is really the end game for the Kurds. The Kurds in Rojava and really the POAD had played a very different game than the KRG. And part of the Öcalani philosophy and way of being is really an autonomy and not a national movement. So if the Kurds can get in Syria a certain degree of independence, autonomy, cultural independence, and they realize that they need to negotiate it, and if they can learn something from the experience in Iraq and what had happened after the referendum and really the failure, perhaps they need to be wise and say, look, we need to understand who are the players to be and who should we be dealing with. Really, the end game is to keep what they have achieved, and they have achieved quite a lot. There is an autonomy on the ground, there is a structure, and the Kurds would like to maintain it. If Russia is now the power to be, and if the Americans have already betrayed the Kurds not so far away from Rojava, perhaps it is wise for them to stick with the powers that can actually help them achieve their objectives.
We'll keep a close eye on that, Dr. Bombs, as we stay with the Kurds now in Iraq. And Kurdistan's leader, Masoud Barzani, said he will step down as president on November 1st. This only a day after Iraqi forces and Kurdish Peshmerga fighters reached an agreement to stop fighting in northern Iraq. Barzani accused rival leader Jalal Talabani of handing over the oil city of Kirkuk without a fight and criticized the US for allowing its tanks to be used against the Kurds. He also defended his decision to hold the September 25th referendum, saying its results can never be erased.
رفراندومیان کردووە بە بەهانە کە ئەنفال کراین کیمیاباران کراین کۆمەڵکوژ کراین هەر چەند ماوەیەک پێش ئێستا ئێزیدیەکان کە کۆمەڵکوژ کران نانبڕ کرا ئەم گەلە ئایا ئەو وەختە کەس باسی ڕفراندومی کردبوو؟
Meantime, the Shiite Hassid Shabi Brigade has seized the northern Iraqi-Syrian border crossing of Faish Kabor, forcing Kurdish Peshmerga fighters to retreat. The operation, conducted under Iranian Revolutionary Guard command, masked as an Iraqi military operation to liberate al-Qaim from the hands of the Islamic State group. Debka File sources reveals 4 objectives for the operation. First, to cut off the overland corridor between Iraqi Kurdistan and the 3 Syrian enclaves ruled by the YPG militia. The Syrian militia are now barred from coming to the aid of the Peshmerga in Iraq. Second, to close the only open door remaining to Kurdish residents seeking to leave Iraqi Kurdistan after the Iraqi government seized its air links, seizing the international airports at Erbil and Sulaymaniyah and placing the semi-autonomous Iraqi Kurdistan under siege. Third, to leave the US Army with only 1 air transit after conquering Faish Kabor, America's only land crossing for supplies into northern Syria. Lastly, Iran has completed its overland bridge to Syria via Iraq. Let's turn back to our guest, Dr. Nir Bombs. Barzani has resigned, blaming the rival Talabani family for the US for abandoning the Kurdish plight. What's next for Iraq's Kurds?
First of all, Barzani had made something rather rare in the Middle East, which is really taking responsibility and showing political maturity and really trying to clear a certain path of change that is very much needed, as he was, and he indeed was, the one who drove the referendum and the entire process. His words were important, and I think he's also correct by articulating the betrayal. This was a double betrayal, one with his fellow Kurds, really a day after some of this was coordinated between the 2 families, between the 2 factions, between Barzani and Talabani, and that was indeed a betrayal. And second, with the Americans, since, again, much had happened between the Kurds and the Americans, both in Iraq, in Rojava, as we've said, in Syria. The Kurds have been very loyal allies, and now they find themselves being attacked by American-made weapons in the hands of Shia militias that are supported by Iran. So now I think the Kurds would need to regroup. They need to reassert their own leadership and their own ranks. There's some splits within the ranks of leadership and also within the ranks of the Talabani's party, and some people that have left him as a certain degree of protest over these moves. You're going to have a period probably in where some of this political issues will percolate. Unity remains a challenge. But then leadership will emerge, and the Kurds will attempt to continue, find a new status quo, figure out a way to reopen the arrangements, reopen Kurdistan, that is now, as you've just stated, is literally in a certain siege, and will try to work further. And I think, as Barzani had said, the Kurds will not going to be able to forget the referendum, and certainly are not going to abandon their quest for more independence.
And let's just take a quick look at this new report revealed today by the Debka Files that the Kurdish border post has been captured in an operation led by Iran's military wing. What do you make of that?
I think that we need to be cautious in looking at all of these the developments and dimensions on the ground. We've had a number of important developments, partially because the Iranians and others recognize the vacuum. There is a serious vacuum. The Kurds, the Peshmergas, have lost some degrees of control. The ranks are split. The leadership is busy with internal struggles, and therefore it's easier to advance. And this is really part of what the Shia militias, the Iranians and their allies are trying to do. I think that after a certain period and where some of these events will begin to settle, there's going to be a new status quo, and there's going to be an attempt to re-galvanize, organize, and again, defend what is left to defend. But really, this is about grabbing. This is about grabbing interest, grabbing border, grabbing territory, weakening the Kurds, and unfortunately, they are certainly weaker than they were just a month ago.
Weaker Kurds. Okay, that's all the time we have for this segment. And thanks to our guest, Dr. Nir Boms, Research Fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at the Tel Aviv University, for your commentary. Moving to Gaza now, and Hamas security chief Tawfiq Abu Naim has been hospitalized after being wounded in a car bombing in the Gaza Strip. Hamas blaming Israel for its involvement, but in a Debka Files exclusive, its intelligence sources saying the assassination attempt was not the work of Israel or radical Salafi groups opposed to Palestinian rapprochement, but by supporters of Hamas's own former interior minister. The plot said to be the result of an internal feud within Hamas over the unity deal signed in Cairo with rival political group Fatah. Hamad said to be critical of the agreement and flying in the face of Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh and other Gaza leaders hoping to push it through. They reportedly ordered security chief Abu Naim to crack down on Hamad's followers, and in an apparent strike back at his supporters being jailed, an explosive device was planted in Abu Naim's car, parked outside the Nusayrat refugee camp on Friday. Now visiting Naim in hospital, Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh called to maintain the agreement with Fatah, come what may.
أدعو إخواننا في حركة فتح وأدعو الأخ أبو مازن على وجه الخصوص إلى التسريع في خطوات تنفيذ المصالحة الفلسطينية حتى نقطع الطريق على أي طرف يريد أن يخرب هذه المصالحة، وأيضا حتى يتم تمتين الجبهة الداخلية لشعبنا في وجه أي محاولة من هذا القبيل. بشكل عام السيد اللواء بخير، صحته ممتازة، معنوية.
Let's hear more about this report from Debka File Editor-in-Chief, Giora Shamis. Giora, tell us more about this so-called inside job.
Well, I mean, that's very typical of the Hamas. They are the leaderships or the new leadership of the Hamas, especially Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar, are trying to silence the objection or the groups of people. It's not only the groups in the leadership, it's also the grassroots of Hamas. They are against their sort of peace process with Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. And each of them, and lately Hamas is trying to, or the new leadership is trying to silence the opposing section, and it's coming to a violence. We haven't had a lot about it because, I mean, they sort of haven't, nobody is actually publishing it or telling it, and they are arresting, they are harassing, they are boycotting property, cars, bank accounts, everything that they can put their hands on of the people that are against this process. At the end, Mr. Fathi Hamad decided enough is enough, and he just decided to act against Tawfiq Abu Naim, that he is in charge of this operation. And that's how things are being settled in the Hamas leadership and in the Gaza Strip.
Thank you for that exclusive report there from Debka File Editor-in-Chief Giora Shamis.
Thank you.
Now, it may sound like a SpaceX fantasy, but Saudi Arabia has revealed plans for a futuristic $500 billion city that will contain more robots than humans. Announced by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the project, dubbed NEOM, will span some 10,000 square miles on the Red Sea coastline, stretching into Jordan and Egypt and covering land twice the size of neighboring Qatar. Run entirely on alternative energy and making use of drones and driverless cars. If the NEOM vision comes true, Debka analysts saying it is set to revolutionize the region by extending a free trade zone to Israel, Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. It will link the Saudi and Egyptian Red Sea coasts by a large bridge and connect the port cities of Eilat and Aqaba by fast train to a new port in the Gaza Strip. Also at the summit, an unusual way to celebrate the ambitious NEOM project. Saudi Arabia became the first country to give a robot named Sophia full citizenship. But social media users were quick to outline the hypocrisy of the move, pointing out that those same citizenship rights aren't afforded to many humans in the country. Others said it appears to elevate the robot's rights above those of real women, as Sophia appeared on stage alone without the male guardian required by Saudi law and with her head and body uncovered. Now to a roundup of this week's headlines you may have missed. The news in brief. A television interview of a top Qatari official confessing the so-called truth behind the origins of the war in Syria is going viral. Hamad bin Jassim bin Jaber Al Thani claiming that Qatar, along with Saudi Arabia, Turkey and the United States, began shipping weapons to the opposition in Syria ever since the start of the war, 6 years ago. New images have been released of Iranian Revolutionary Guards General Qasem Soleimani visiting the grave of former Iraqi Vice President Jalal Talabani after he passed away last month. This just 2 days ahead of the Iraqi capture of the Kurdish city of Kirkuk, clinching an alleged Iranian pact with the Talabani family to topple the ruling KRG party in Erbil. UK opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn turns down an invitation to join an official dinner with the British and Israeli Prime Ministers this week to mark the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, which helped pave the way for a Jewish nation-state. The chair of the Jewish Leadership Council calling the snub, quote, deeply unfortunate. And a challenger to Turkey's president as an ex-minister launches a new political party named Good Party with a promise to shake up the country's politics. Former Interior Minister Meral Akşener opposed Erdogan's drive for greater presidential powers that was eventually passed in a referendum last April. She's now vowing to fight for a better Turkey ahead of elections set for 2019. Well, that wraps up this week's edition of the Debka Files. Thanks to this week's guest, Dr. Nir Boms of the Tel Aviv University, and Debka Files' own editor-in-chief, Giora Shamis, for joining us. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime on the Debka website. That's debka.com. Or why not sign on to the weekly newsletter for more in-depth breaking news stories, insight, and analysis from the region. From myself and the whole team here in Tel Aviv, bye-bye for now.